Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the National Commission, thank you for inviting me today to testify about Al-Qaeda. I'm not going to read my statement because I agree with what has been said before, but there are some few differences that I want to highlight, and they have to do with the ideology, the members themselves, Al-Qaeda members, and the growth of the organization. Unlike my colleague, I actually studied it from the bottom up instead of the top down, and various patterns actually emerge. But before we can understand the patterns, we have to understand why they're doing it, the ideology. Al-Qaeda is part of a global movement which I call the Global Salafi Jihad. The movement has its root in Egypt. I completely agree. It's a violent Muslim revivalist movement which seeks to return to pure and authentic Islam as practiced by the Prophet and his companion. To them, Islam is the answer, and only a recreation of the practices of the devout ancestors, Salaf in Arabic, will bring glory and prominence back to Muslims. Salafists advocate a strict interpretation of the Quran, and they view with skepticism any later innovation, for it might be a heretical corruption of the original message. And here there's been an evolution in the ideology. I don't really kind of go back 20 years and kind of see the ideology the same as it was 20 years ago, but the evolution which came to its ultimate conclusion in 1998 was a process of evolution. The first is a concept of jihad, and jihad is often a defensive strategy when the land of Islam are invaded by infidels. And this was the strategy advocated by Abdullah Azzam in Afghanistan. A second strategy, one that's overlooked because we're all focusing on jihad and violent movement, is a strategy, a peaceful strategy of dawah, the call to Islam. It consists of peacefully preaching the strict and literal imitation of the Prophet and his companion as a model of Islamic society. This is a strategy of the Tablighi Jama'at, a born-again Islamist movement operating informally at the grassroots level. It's been very successful, but because it shies away from undue publicity and stays away from politics, it has attracted very little attention. A little bit like Al-Qaeda before they started bombing. But they're peaceful. A third strategy is what I would call the Salafi Jihad, and that was the one advocated by the Egyptian Salafists. They looked at their own society and they branded it Jahiliyyah, which is a barbaric state of ignorance that existed before the Prophet's revelation, because the modern leaders of Muslim state refused to impose the Sharia, the strict Quranic law, and the true Islamic way of life. As such, they accused their leaders of being apostate, deserving death, and indeed they killed Anwar al-Sadat. They advocate a violent overthrow of their regime, and the priority here is to actually overthrow your own regime. It's really to fight the near enemy, as they put it, as opposed to the far enemy. And then when they all congregated, and Dr. Fendi is right, a lot of the Egyptians went to Afghanistan, and when they met there, they really developed this global perspective. And that's a fourth strategy, and the global Salafi Jihad. It was really first proclaimed by Osama bin Laden in his 1996 fatwa, and it reverses the previous strategy. Now the priority is the far enemy, i.e. the United States, as opposed to the near enemy. And the idea is that without the far enemy, the United States supporting the local governments would not be able to survive. And their strategy is a need to inflict the maximum casualties against the opponent, for this is a language understood by the West, and concentrate on the method of martyrdom operations as the most efficient in terms of damages and least costly to the jihad. Al-Qaeda is only one of those groups. I'm going to skip over the history because I think that's been covered pretty well. And what I'd like to do now is to give you a composite of about 150 members of that jihad that I've collected and give you a picture of who those people are. They're very heterogeneous. There's three large patterns that emerge. About 60% came from what I call core Arab countries, mostly Saudi Arabia and Egypt. 30% came from Maghreb Arab countries, and they're fairly important, especially in Western Europe, or even here. Ahmed Rizam is part of that. And 10% came from Indonesia. In terms of socioeconomic status, 2/3 came from solid upper middle class backgrounds. Most of the rest came from what's called the excluded Maghreb immigrants, or second generation in France, as well as Western Christian converts. They all came from caring, intact families. The Indonesians were uniformly religious as children. About 60% of the core Arab children were, and almost none of the Maghreb Arab children were. As a group, they were relatively well educated, with over 60% attending colleges. Only the Indonesian group was exclusively educated in religious schools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Most of them had a good occupation, and only a quarter were considered unskilled, with few prospects before them. 3/4 were married, and the majority had children. I detected no mental illness in this group or any common psychological predisposition for terror. The average age for joining was about 26 years. The Indonesian joined at a later age, the core Arabs at a younger age. 3/4 of the group decided to join when they were expatriates. That means they were living in a country where they did not grow up. An additional 10% were second generations who felt a strong pull for the country of their parents. So about 85% were literally cut off from their culture and social origin. And I'm going to develop that a little bit more. The majority of the rest were Saudis, on whom we know very little. So I can't really tell you much about that. Compounding their isolation in the new country were the fact that they were underemployed. By the time they joined the jihad, there was a dramatic shift in devotion to their faith. So the only significant finding here is that the terrorists felt isolated, lonely, emotionally alienated. Otherwise, they were a very diverse group. How did they join the jihad? They did it through pre-existing social bonds with people who were already terrorists, or they decided altogether to join the jihad as a group. Affiliation with the jihad was through friendship, kinship, discipleship, and worship. 65% of the cases had pre-existing friendship bonds with people that were already in the jihad. The typical scenario was a homesick young man to drift toward familiar settings such as mosques to find companionship and alleviate their loneliness. Their clusters of friends formed spontaneously, and they often moved in together in apartments. Another 15% joined through relatives already in the jihad. The Indonesians were all disciples of the same teacher. They first studied in one of two religious boarding schools and then joined the Jamaat Islamiyah, which had been founded by the teacher. The last 10% gave religious beliefs as the only reason they joined the jihad. But whatever source of their social bonds, these groups underwent a period of intense social interaction in their apartments mostly, and developed strong mutual intimacy which relieved their previous distress. As they became closer, they progressively adopted the belief and faith of their friends, their most extreme friends. Their new Salafi faith distanced them further from their childhood friends and families, leading to increased isolation and loyalty to the group, which in turn intensified their faith. They were ready to join the jihad. The critical factor, and this is a key issue, was the existence of a human link to the jihad who could actually arrange training in Afghanistan. This was usually a peripheral acquaintance and a chance encounter, and formal invitation and acceptance to join the jihad was actually done in Afghanistan after senior members were able to evaluate them. In terms of growth, The common element detected in all of them was, of course, the link to the jihad itself. So if we trace the links, we can actually see how they grow. Unlike a military organization, the global jihad was structured around popular human hubs surrounded by more isolated human nodes. From the historical data, it seems that the jihad grew haphazardly around these hubs. Surprisingly, there is no evidence of a comprehensive top-down recruitment program in the global jihad. The pressure comes from the bottom up. Prospective young men eager to join the movement. I have detected no dedicated recruiter in my search, and I've looked for it. Nor is there any evidence of any recruitment committee with a full staff and its own budget in Al-Qaeda headquarters, nor any evidence of aggressive publicity campaigns to increase membership. This absence of proselytism kept its profile low enough, despite its size, that it avoided detection by us in this country. On the other hand, because of its haphazard growth, it left it vulnerable to the preference of the people who volunteer for it. So that left huge gaps in it. Specifically, it's without a pool of members able to operate clandestinely in the US and thus limits its ability to wage war on US soil. This is the number one priority for Al-Qaeda or any of those organizations in the jihad. The growth of the jihad depends on its ability to gain new members. Anger at the US policy will increase the pool of potential candidates, but they still need to establish a crucial link with the jihad to become part of it. The degree of tolerance of the jihad also affects its rate of growth. In a tolerant country, like most Western democratic countries, or Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Salafi mosque prior to 9/11, potential members could listen to people who boast of their connection to the jihad. I was in Afghanistan, I trained, I'm a hero, and so people approach them and say, gee, we'd like to do the same, can you connect us? After 9/11, this has changed dramatically. People who could have provided a potential link now become reluctant to reveal their affiliation. The result of this growth pattern is a network that's very robust, but it's also very vulnerable to targeted attacks, namely against those, what I call social hubs. If the hubs are destroyed, the system breaks down into isolated nodes. The jihad will be incapable of mounting sophisticated large-scale operations like the 9/11 attacks and be reduced to small attacks by singleton. These hubs are vulnerable because most communication goes through them. By following communication back to them, good police work would be able to identify and arrest these human hubs. This strategy has already shown considerable success. In terms of policy recommendation, there are several. The greatest priority right now is extensive penetration of these movements. The best bet for penetration lie in recruitment from the pool of those who went through the training but decide not to join the jihad. That pool right now is being prosecuted for providing material support and resources to the jihad. Before prosecuting them, I would suggest that all efforts should be made to try to turn them around and have them go back and join the jihad to penetrate the jihad. However, at present, it's unlikely because of the fact that they fear prosecution. Perhaps a program of immunity in exchange for a good faith effort to fight, to help fight the jihad may convince them to actually step forward.
Wind up,
I'm sorry?
To wind up.
Yes, I'm almost done.
Thank you.
It also requires the active support of American and other Muslim community, and I'm concerned here about some accounts of strong-arm governmental tactics antagonizing Muslim community in this country and elsewhere. We really have to repair those bonds. Also, I think that we need to elicit the help of peaceful movements, revivalist movements, such as Tablighi Jama'at, who would like to get rid of all the people who've penetrated them and are violent. Just like we allied ourselves with socialists in Western Europe to fight the communists, here I think it's the same strategy. And I think that, as Dr. Fendi mentioned, we really need to clamp down on the anti-Western and anti-American hate speech. And here I would suggest the establishment of an international anti-defamation league to monitor such speech and work with the press, religious organizations, governments and respective justice systems to condemn and control it. And there are some indication that now the Saudis, after the May 12th bombings, are starting to do that. The last item is the war in Iraq. This is, now that we're there, it's going to become a litmus test of our policy in all the Middle East. If we succeed, great. It's going to be a model for other people to emulate. If we fail, it's going to increase our problems, mainly the pool of people going to fight us. So despite our major victories, we have not yet defeated this movement. If we relax our vigilance, its network will spontaneously reconstitute. If we continue our fight based on understanding of its network and dynamics, and with good police work and intelligence work combined with more global measures and especially international assistance, we should be able to conclusively eliminate it. Thank you.